rate of change in your life.
Hmm.
So, for example, most people write their first will when they go on vacation away from their children. They're like all in a panic about what happens if I die on vacation and what's going to happen to my children. And then they don't think about it again. And then they update it again, maybe when they downsize or their kids move away from home, but sometimes not. So you can easily invalidate a will because it's 30 years old and your life has moved on and the people that you've named and the beneficiaries you have predeceased you or things have changed. So if you are going to write a will, make sure that you review it at the rate of change in your life. So when big changes happen, it's important that we review that document, make sure it's still up to date, and make sure that it still meets our needs.
If you had just kind of a real general suggestion of like how many times, like how many years should pass before you review your will? Like every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years? Because I know you're saying the rate of change. It's like, I don't know, life is changing all the time. What would be a rate of change that would get me to do it?
All right. So there are some critical points in our lives or some things that happen in our lives. And in one of my presentations, I have a whole list. But basically, the rate of change that I'm talking about is you acquire a new person in your life, whether it's a spouse, a child, a stepchild, you gain family, or you lose family, or you lose people that are close to you. So that would be a big change that would trigger maybe you need to review your will. You gain or lose major assets. You buy a new house, you buy a new car, you sell the family cabin, you inherit a very expensive piece of art. These are things that should trigger that your assets have changed and that you need to change your will, or at least review it and make sure that your will still encompasses those kinds of details. So when I'm talking about the rate of change in our lives, what I'm talking about is the big changes, the big rites of passage that we have in our life: marriage, death, graduation, those types of things. You become a homeowner, you retire. Is there a schedule? Why not review your will every year when you do your taxes?
But to do that, do you have to consult your lawyer if you want to make any changes every single time?
Well, I mean, again, it depends on how your will is written, because you can have a will, you can have codicils to your will that just need to be initials. Here in Alberta, we have the ability to do holographic wills, which are just handwritten, non-witnessed wills. In British Columbia, not so much. So it's different from province to province and from state to state. But do you need to see a lawyer every time you want to make a change in your will? I think that depends on, I guess the technical answer would be yes. If you want to change your will, you do need to see a lawyer, and you don't want to do that all the time. But really, honestly, for the big changes, I think is where it becomes important to make sure that those things are documented legally. Things that may cause, as you were talking about, drama early on with family members, things that might cause family drama, like the exchange of assets or leaving of legacy and things that are worth monetary value, for example.
I'm thinking of every single person that I know that is like around-ish my peer group, around their, late 40s, early 50s, plus everyone I know who's like 10-ish years younger than me. I can't think of one single person that I know, including myself, that's out there reviewing I don't even have a will, actually. So I'm trying to think of anyone that I even know that has a will or reviews a will, and I can't think of a darn person. So when do people actually start doing this? Or when should they?
Much like when we think about death and dying, there's usually some sort of catalyzing event that makes us think about this. So for different people, it's different things. Usually people start thinking about having a will, like I said, when they travel away from home for the first time without their children. That's usually a really big one for people, because they're thinking about what happens to the children if something happens to me. Does there need to be a catalyzing event? No, but it's usually what gets people thinking about it. So a death, a pandemic. There was a bit of a spike in wills when the pandemic hit. But to be quite honest, any time is the right time to have a will, because we're never guaranteed how much time we have. The other side of that is you can always look at the risk of what happens if I don't have a will. And you can make a decision as to whether you're willing to take that risk or not. So does everybody have to have a will? Well, it makes it easier for your executor and your estate. But if you don't have a lot of assets and you don't have a lot of things to leave people, how much is it going to help you to have a will? You know, lawyers and estate planners will say, yes, have a will. And I do say, yeah, it's a good idea to have a will. However, it's entirely up to you how much you want to risk what happens to your estate. And part of what I do is educating people on this is what happens when you don't have a will, right?
What does an estate planner do?
An estate planner is someone who looks at your financial portfolio and plans to ensure that most of what you own, your assets, are transferred in a way where they're not going to get heavily taxed and is not going to be a financial burden for the people you're leaving it for. So they manage your money, your financials generally.
And what happens if you don't have a will and you don't have an executor, but you have stuff, like you own a house and you have these things?
Worst case scenario, what happens is the government, when your estate goes to probate, well, probate is validating of the will, but basically when you die, the government will decide who is going to administer your estate and close out your life. So two things are going to happen. Somebody close to you is going to petition to become your executor or your estate administrator. Or if there is nobody who steps forward, the government will assign someone to administer your estate. It's generally a government worker who is an estate administrator of many people. And they will use a mathematical formula, an algorithm, if you will, to distribute your assets after your funeral arrangements are paid for, your taxes are filed, including your death taxes, all your creditors are taken care of, and then whatever is left over, residuals, then the beneficiaries, it'll just be divided equally. There is a formula related to how many children you have, and if it's not your children or your grandchildren, your parents, and there's just a formula.
Did you just say death taxes?
Yes.
You get taxed for dying?
Well, you have a set of final taxes that have to be done. And depending on when you die in the course of the year and how close you are to the regular tax season or how long the year has passed, in your final year, you may have two sets of taxes, your regular taxes and your final taxes. But basically what happens when you die, and part of the role of the executor, is to valuate your estate on the date of your death. Oh. So their job is to figure out what you're worth in the eyes of the government, and then that worth gets taxed.
Part of what probably people don't like talking about this is it's just like horrifying, the stuff that you discover.